أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لا أقسم بيوم القيامة ولا أقسم بالنفس اللوامة. أيحسب الإنسان أن لن نجمع عظامه بلى قادرين على أن نسوي بنانه بل يريد الإنسان ليفجر أمامه يسأل أيان يوم القيامة فإذا برق البصر وخسف القمر وجمع الشمس والقمر يقول الإنسان يومئذ أين المفر كلا لا وزر إلى ربك يومئذ المستقر ينبأ الإنسان يومئذ بما قدم وأخر بل الإنسان على نفسه بصيرة ولو ألقى معاذيره لا تحرك به لسانك لتعجل به إن علينا جمعه وقرآنه فإذا قرأناه فاتبع قرآنه ثم إن علينا بيانه كلا بل تحبون العاجلة وتذرون الآخرة وجوه يومئذ ناظرة إلى ربها ناظرة ووجوه يومئذ باسرة تظن أن يفعل بها فاقرة كلا إذا بلغت التراقي وقيل من راق وظن أنه الفراق والتفت الساق بالساق إلى ربك يومئذ المساق فلا صدق ولا صلى ولكن كذب وتولى ثم ذهب إلى أهله يتمطى أولى لك فأولى ثم أولى لك فأولى أيحسب الإنسان أن يترك سدى ألم يكن نطفة من مني يمنى ثم كان علقة فخلق فسوى فجعل منه الزوجين الذكر والأنثى أليس ذلك بقادر على أن يحيي الموتى صدق الله العلي العظيم.
وأتوجه إليك بنبيك نبي الرحمة محمد صلى الله عليه وآله. يا أبا القاسم يا رسول الله، يا إمام الرحمة، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يديك حاجاتنا يا وجيها. يا أبا الحسن، يا أمير المؤمنين، يا علي بن أبي طالب، يا حجة الله على خلقك، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يديك حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله. يا فاطمة الزهراء، يا بنت محمد، يا قرة عين الرسول، يا سيدتنا ومولاتنا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يديك حاجاتنا يا وجيهة عند الله، اشفعي لنا. يا أبا محمد، يا حسن بن علي، أيها المجتبى يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقك، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يديك حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله. يا أبا عبد الله، يا حسين بن علي، أيها الشهيد يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقه، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يديك حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله. يا أبا الحسن، يا علي بن الحسين، يا زين العابدين يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقك، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يديك حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله. يا أبا جعفر، يا محمد بن علي، أيها الباكر يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقك، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يديك حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله. يا أبا عبد الله، يا جعفر بن محمد، أيها الصادق يا ابن رسول الله، يا حجة الله على خلقك، يا سيدنا ومولانا، إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله، وقدمناك بين يديك حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله. يا أبا الحسن يا موسى بن جعفر أيها القادم يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقك يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يديك حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله يا أبا الحسن يا علي بن موسى أيها الرضا يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقك يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يديك حاجاتنا يا وجيها يا أبا جعفر يا محمد بن علي أيها التقي الجواد يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقك يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يديك حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله يا أبا الحسن يا علي بن محمد أيها الحادي النقي يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقك يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يديك حاجاتنا
يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله
يا أبا محمد يا حسن بن علي أيها الزكي الأصغري يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقك يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يديك حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا يا وصي الحسن والخلف الحجة أيها القائم المنتظر المهدي يا ابن رسول الله يا حجة الله على خلقك يا سيدنا ومولانا إنا توجهنا واستشفعنا وتوسلنا بك إلى الله وقدمناك بين يديك حاجاتنا يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله يا وجيها عند الله اشفع لنا عند الله حاجات يا سادتي وموالي إني توجهت بكم أئمتي وأدتي ليوم فقري وحاجتي إلى الله وتوسلت بكم إلى الله واستشفعت بكم إلى الله فاشفعوا لي عند الله واستنقذوني من ذنوبي عند الله فإنكم وسيلتي إلى الله وبحبكم وبقربكم أرجو نجاة من الله فكونوا عند الله رجائي या सादत या औलिया अल्लाह सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि अजमईन वलानल्लाहु अदा अल्लाहिद्दालिमीन मिनल अव्वलीन वल आखिरीन आमीन रब्बल आलमीन। सूरतुल मुबारकत फातिहा।
सलवात। आज भी ज़ैनब की आती है सदा भाई हुसैन, तेरा चेहरा तेरी आँखें फूल कब पाई हुसैन, चलते ना के से गिराया खुद को जलती रेत पर, घुटनियों के बल में तेरी लाश तक आई हुसैन, बस में घबराई थी खंजर तुझ पे चलता देख कर, फिट किसी मुश्किल में गिर कर मैं न घबराई हुसैन, कौन था जो मरने वालों मैं नहीं था खूबरू, भूलने बैठी तो किस किस की न याद आई हुसैन, दूर उफ्तादा सफर से लौट कर मैंने नवेद ठंडा पानी जब पिया बस तेरी याद आई हुसैन, ठंडा पानी जब पिया बस तेरी याद आई हुसैन, आज भी ज़ैनब की आती है सदा भाई हुसैन। सलवात। यहाँ संभल कर कदम उठाना ये करबला है, ये करबला है, ये बात हरगिज़ ना भूल जाना, ये करबला है, ये करबला है। यहाँ संभल कर कदम उठाना ये करबला है, ये करबला है। जहाँ में सब्र और रिज़ा यही है, खुदाए सब्र और रिज़ा यही है। यहाँ पे आते हैं चल के मेहदी, बहिश्ते ज़हरा ये सरज़मी है। यहाँ है ज़हरा का न जाना, ये करबला है, ये करबला है। यहाँ संभल कर कदम उठाना ये करबला है, ये करबला है। दुआएं देंगे हुसैन तुमको, यहाँ पे आंसू अगर बहाए, जहाँ पे बेटी ने बेवतन की सितमगरों से तमाच खाए, यहाँ पे खुशियों को भूल जाना ये करबला है, ये करबला है। यहाँ संभल कर कदम उठाना ये करबला है, ये करबला है। यहाँ पे गुजरी है वो क़यामत, मिला न उसको सुकून अब तक, रिदाए छिनने के गम में आबिद लहद में रोता है खून अब तक। यहाँ पे हरगिज़ ना मुस्कुराना ये करबला है, ये करबला है। यहाँ संभल कर कदम उठाना ये करबला है, ये करबला है। सवारी आएंगी कि वहाँ से नजफ की जानिब निगाह रखना, जब आए शाम गरीबा उस दम अली को ज़ैनब का पुरसा देना। तुम आंसुओं को दिए जलाना ये करबला है, ये करबला है। यहाँ संभल कर कदम उठाना ये करबला है, ये करबला है। सलवात। सूरत मुबारक अल-फातिहा। Sayyid Hasan, respected elders, brothers and sisters in Imam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Surah Al-Fatiha is requested for all marhumin listed on the screen as well as all other marhumin. Surah Al-Barak Al-Fatiha. Dua Shafai Mariz is requested for all those in need here and elsewhere, as well as those listed on the screen. Let us recite together. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Amma yujibul mustarra iza da'ahu yakshifu sur. 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 Amma yujibul sur. Let us now invite Sayyid Hasan Rizvi to please come forward and recite tonight's Majalis. Bar Muhammad and wa ali Muhammad, salawat.
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد، صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. Mu'mineen, mu'minat, brothers and sisters in Islam and Iman, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. When we talk about the dhulm and the oppression that not only the Ahlul Bayt faced during the times of the Umayyads and the Abbasids, the larger Muslim community, the Shias and what was deemed as the Ahlul Sunnah after some time, they also felt the dhulm that was taking place then as well. And the types of oppression that they engaged in were the types that even today many governments will use these same sort of tactics. You know, the examples that we've talked about before are, one, in the way that there were sanctions and types of financial pressure put on the Ahlul Bayt, and especially the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, the Shia. How they were cut off from their Imam, they were cut off from taxes, money was stolen from them and seized from them, property was taken from them. Physically, we know that they were intimidated, they were harassed, imprisoned, tortured. One of the other types of oppression, which doesn't seem very obvious when you look at it at face value, but which is still something which applies to oppressive governments to this day, is that when a government wants to exert control, to show dominance and force, one of the realms that they have to show their dominance is in the legal realm, in terms of law. Let me give you a modern day example, and then we'll take it back to the example of during the time of the Abbasids. So, certain ideas and concepts and governmental tactics in one generation under one, let's say, presidency are deemed as, let's say, human rights violations or unthinkable. But then you'll see another president or a prime minister or a leader comes along, and through legal loopholes and different means, they're able to change the whole narrative. So for example, if you remember, let's say around Bush Jr. when he was elected, right? So we're talking in what we call now the post 9/11 world, that idea. You know, if you had mentioned to somebody that torture was going to be used as a normal U.S. military tactic, you know, people wouldn't have believed you. But you see that this was a major, you know, governmental policy. And it wasn't just, you know, one person signing off and saying, yeah, this is what I want, you know, prisoners or enemy combatants, whatever, to be tortured. There was a whole legal system, you know, defined and designed like that. You know, you had, I believe his name was John Woo. He wrote, you know, these legal papers which were used, right, in the U.S. legal systems to defend what they were doing, to show that, look, there's precedents, we are allowed to do this, the president has the right to do X, Y, Z. And that became the way that, you know, the courts started, you know, taking care of things. The people then, after they heard this type of legal argument or they saw the dominant legal principle, they followed suit as well. Now, of course, there's other factors that allow people to believe in these types of things too. You know, media, pop culture, and things like that. You know, around that time, I'm sure you'll remember too, there were all these TV shows. You know, one of my favorites was 24, right, starring Kiefer Sutherland. So they had these TV shows as well where they would show people being tortured and then, you know, getting information out of them. So this was, you know, it's a part of the culture that's there. So from the governmental side, it's, look, we control what is right and wrong through legal means. Some of you who say it's wrong, it doesn't matter because we have the legal right to say, we have legal dominance and power and we exert control. So this is the way that governments, even nowadays, they exert their influence and control. Now, obviously, when we're thinking back to an Islamic empire, these false khulafa that were there, this same thing came in mind as well. Now, maybe in some other session, inshallah, maybe in the future, if Allah provides us tawfiq, we can speak a bit more about how and why this happened during the Abbasid time, right? This whole idea of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah specifically was an Abbasid creation, right? This is, the term came out during their time. They created these four madhahib that exist among the Ahl Sunnah to this day. So there, I mean, yes, they had these educational institutes and there was learning and education happening, but they knew that, you know, at the end of the day, Islam, like let's say the religion of Judaism, these are legal religions. They're religions of law. It's not just that you believe something and, you know, once you believe and so being your savior, you go to heaven. Or be a good person, you go to heaven. No. You know, many faiths, like Judaism, like Islam, have this, you know, law. This has the structure there. So those who control that law, they gain and wield a lot of power as well. And the Khulafa knew this. So in order to exert their influence and their dominance and control, what they had to do is make sure that the people in their courts, the qudat, the judges, those who were giving fatwa out, they were in the pockets of the khulafa. So the khulafa had to exert their control like that. So when this was taking place, this was one of the ways of sidelining the Ahlul Bayt, right, from generation to generation. Because if, let's say, one of the imams gave their legal opinion, then it'd be very easy for everybody else around them to say, look, all these other famous judges and qadis and ulama around us, they're saying the complete opposite. Like, okay, you followers, you know, you Shia, you followers of your so-and-so imam, you guys are praying with your hand down. Look at the rest of the Muslims. We're praying with our hands folded. So you guys in the minority, we've got legal backing for what we're doing. Right? And sometimes, you know, even nowadays, these are the kind of things that, you know, bother us. In the larger scheme of things too, the laws that we follow, when we don't understand where they come from, how they're practiced, what's the reasoning behind them, then that, you know, puts a lot of, let's say, identity pressure on us, right? Because we are in the legal minority. We don't have the same, you know, idea about, let's say, freedom, right? The main conversation, freedom of what to wear, freedom of speech, and justice and liberty, all these fancy terms. Our definitions, our understanding of these concepts are much different than they're explained in nations, especially like Western nations. So the Khulafa knew of this power, and they would make sure to exert that power to make sure people were being pushed away from the Ahlul Bayt. But, of course, because these judges that were in the lands, they only had limited access. They were making errors in their judgments, obviously. We talked about this a little bit, you know, on the previous session on Sunday night. So they would get into their own conflicts. where a certain court case would be brought in front of them, or the Khalifa would ask, the head judge, what do I do here? And the people in his court would disagree. And then now, if the general public saw that, the leaders, the court officials, those judges are in disagreement and there's not a clear decision there, then the people would have said something's wrong with the Khalifa then. And this would have come back in the government. So in those few instances, the same thing that happened during the time of the first three Khulafa, they had to turn to the members of the Ahlul Bayt because there was no way around it. They said, look, we deep down know that the only people who actually have knowledge of these legal principles are the household of Muhammad and Ala Muhammad alayhi wassalatu wassalam. So especially during the time of somebody like Mutawakkil, right? This Abbasi, one of the most tyrannical Abbasi leaders that was there. He had many issues in his court as well. And when these judges came forward, they would try to rule or preside on a case, they would end up disagreeing. And Mutawakkil was forced. He said, if you guys cannot come to a decision, you're not forcing me. I have to go to, the grandson of the Prophet. I have no choice now. And he didn't want to do it, but he knew that he had to solve the situation. And again, we've talked about this before, how the Abbasids, part of them, we would call that Shia, meaning they knew deep down that the Ahlul Bayt, the Imams, were the true sources of knowledge. They knew that, but of course, their love of dunya, their love of power overtook them. And they wanted to dominate and exert their power and influence. So of course, this took place, and what we would like to do tonight is go through two famous stories where these court issues took place. Mutawakkil was unable to solve them. His court officials could not solve them. So he had to turn to our 10th Imam, Imam Ali ibn Muhammad al-Hadi al-Naqi alayhi salatu wassalam. So the first story. There was once a Christian who was caught committing adultery and zina with a Muslim woman. So the court case, again, the trial comes before Mutawakkil, and again, as the Khalifa, he technically presides over it, but his ulama, his court officials are there to kind of assist him. I mean, they figure out what the issue is, they tell him, and then he gives the fatwa or the judicial ruling. So when obviously they came forward, he sees this Christian man who commits zina with a Muslim woman. He's like, okay, this is obviously haram. He shouldn't have done this. He has to be punished. So he turns to the scholars there, and the head of that time, as many of you know, is Yahya ibn Aktham. Right? There's many stories about him where he dealt with the 9th Imam and 10th Imam. Right? They have the famous stories there. So he asked Yahya ibn Aktham, okay, this is the supreme, if we're going to use today's language, he's the supreme qadi, the supreme court judge, right, of Mutawakkil's court. And he says, and then he's like, okay, Mutawakkil asks him, Yahya, what is the ruling in this case? What punishment do we give to him? Now, right before the punishment comes out, right as Yahya is about to say something, this Christian person says, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So now Yahya pauses, he's like, okay. He was about to say something. He said, look, now that this Christian is a Muslim, now the ruling's changed. He said, how so? He said, well, since we know that whenever somebody comes into the fold of Islam, when they come into Islam, those of you who are familiar with your ahkam, Islam, just like water, sunlight, earth, this is one of the mutahirat. In the section of najasat, mutahirat, Islam is considered a mutahir. It can make things pak and clean. In a physical sense and even a spiritual sense. So Yahya ibn Aktham says, look, since now Iman and Islam has entered his heart, all his previous sins are forgiven, there's no punishment anymore. He's confessed in front of all of us, he's a Muslim now, he's completely clean now, we can't, there's no ruling against him, there's no punishment for him. So when that happened, some of the other ulama who were there said, what kind of ruling is that? No, that's not the case at all. The punishment has to be enacted. In fact, it has to be enacted 3 times because it happened while he was a Christian. And then other ulama jump in and say, no, that can't be the ruling. Yeah, he did it when he was a Christian, but now he's a Muslim, so the punishment has to happen once. And then the ones who said, okay, the punishment happens, what is the actual punishment? And they sort of, just went crazy in the court. So they had no idea what to do. And this is when, of course, he says, now I have to write a letter and seek the opinion of Imam al-Naqi alayhi salatu wassalam. So a messenger, according to this narration, a messenger or a letter was sent to the house of the Imam. The Imam sent a reply back and he said, the person, this ex-Christian, now Muslim, apparently, he said he has to be whipped. A simple reply, and he gave it back. So when this reply came back, and Mutawakkil read it out loud to everybody, he says, the grandson of the Prophet says that this person, right, this new Muslim ex-Christian has to be whipped for the zina. Yahya, again, being the Supreme Court judge, says, hold on, this guy, the grandson of the Prophet, who keeps going against me, he went against me again. He's lowering my izzat and my dignity in front of Mutawakkil once again. So he wants to, obviously try to save his name. He says, look, Yahya says, hold on a second. This thing that, the grandson of the Prophet, so-and-so is claiming, has no basis in the Quran and Hadith whatsoever. There's no precedence for this. I have precedence. We know clearly that somebody who becomes Muslim, they become clean. Where is this ruling coming from that, his Islam has, no change and he's still going to get the punishment? It's like, there's no evidence here. He has to bring some sort of evidence. So Mutawakkil says, fine. He sends his messenger back. He says, go back to him and ask and say he has to bring his proof. So when that happens, the Imam, explains the evidence to the messenger and it comes back to the court. So now Mutawakkil, comes back, the letter's back in his hand, and then the response is read out loud. And what is read is the two ayat of the Quran. And they're found in Surah Ghafir, ayah 40, Surah 40, ayat 84 through 85. So he reads it out loud, like this is the Imam's response. He says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. فَلَمَّا رَأَوْا بَأْسَنَا قَالُوا آمَنَّا بِاللَّهِ وَحْدَهُ وَكَفَرْنَا بِمَا كُنَّا بِهِ مُشْرِكِينَ. He said, when they saw our punishment, they said, Amanna billah, we believe in Allah, wahda, by himself, right? Only Allah. وَكَفَرْنَا بِمَا كُنَّا بِهِ مُشْرِكِينَ. Everything that we used to do as kafirs, when we were mushrikeen, we deny all of that now. So the stage is set. He said, look, there's precedence in the Quran of people, when they saw punishment, they said, okay, we're Muslims now, and we've switched. Then, ayah, that's 84, now 85. فَلَمْ يَكُوا يَنْفَعُهُمْ إِيمَانُهُمْ لَمَّا رَأَوْا بَأْسَنَا سُنَّةُ اللَّهِ الَّتِي قَدْ خَلَتْ فِي عِبَادِي وَخَسِرَ هُنَالِكَ الْكَافِرُونَ. And then Allah continues in this ayah, but that iman, that faith does not benefit them at all when our adhab and our punishment comes. There is no benefit from them. This is the sunnah of Allah. So this story, as many of you probably remember, is what happened to Fir'aun and some of his soldiers. Is that when they saw things closing down on them, then they said, okay, now I believe in Allah. And then, as it's revealed then, that look, when you do it at this last second, no, it doesn't get that value anymore. So then they understand, Mutawakkil accepts this logical response. He said, yeah, when this Christian saw that adhab was about to come on him, that's when he switched. He said, the response of the Quran, the sunnah of Allah is very clear, so the punishment must be given out in this way. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So the judges there, the ulama, and of course Mutawakkil showed that, look, one thing we have to keep in mind as well is that we can't be those who think that time is something in our hands. Don't think that when that final hour comes that all of us might be granted this ability where we're on our deathbeds and then we can just automatically say, tawbah, tawbah, astaghfirullah, Allah, I'm sorry for what I did, and now hopefully I'm going with a clean heart. No, it's nice to have that conception of Allah Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim Al-Ghafur Al-Ghaffar. I don't want to take that away from you. What I'm saying is, who put you in charge of time, of zaman? How do you know that you're going to get this last minute, this last second to be able to do this istighfar and tawbah and change your ways? If you and I knew, and we do know something is wrong and something is haram and we shouldn't be doing it, why are we all of a sudden making up some timeline for ourselves that, maybe after I graduate college, that's when I'll stop doing X, Y, Z. After I get this promotion, that's when I'll stop, lying on my resume or whatever. After, I get married, then maybe I'll leave this haram act behind. Why are we putting up, why are we thinking in our minds that we're the ones in control of this? We're thinking that, yes, Allah, I'm sincere that, yeah, when I get to that point, inshallah, I'll give it up. I know that it's a wrong thing for me to do. I should be doing better, but I need some time. I'm in my youth. Let me do a little bit of this. Who says that you're not going to be taken away in your youth? Or, again, this ayah should also keep us in mind that who guarantees that your tawbah and istighfar at those last minutes is going to be accepted at all too? This verse is showing that, look, it's very clear that for some people it's not going to be accepted. That the adhab could come and a person might just switch just because of the adhab, and perhaps Allah says, no, this is not something that I accept. This is not maqbool for me, because the only reason it came was not because of some love or sincerity in your heart, but out of fear of punishment. And for Allah, He could say very clearly that no, that's not enough. So our sort of reminder for ourselves is that if we really see that something is good, then we start it right away. There should be no reason to delay. And if something's bad, then why are we delaying, stopping it right now? If it's a willpower issue, then tell that sincerely to Allah. Say, Allah, I know it's wrong. I shouldn't be doing it. I need you to give me the tawfiq and the willpower so I stop it right away. Allah, I don't want you to put me in the mindset where I have to delay this action and keep doing it year after year after year. I want to stop it right now, but there's something that's blocking me. Allah, I want you to take that block away and help me get on the right path and change my life for the better. The minute I think about it and make this dua and this niyat and this intention. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So this was the first story. Let me share the second story. The second one, so this is technically not a court case here, but it still has to do with a application of a fiqhi ruling. So one day they said Mutawakkil became severely ill, and he made a nadhr. Right? We talked about nadhr the other, last Thursday as well. He made an oath. He swore an oath that he says, I swear to Allah, if I'm cured, if this illness goes away, then I'm going to give dinaran kathiran. I'm going to give a large amount of dinars in the way of Allah as sadaqah. So he makes this nadhr, does it sincerely, and that's it. Then he gets better, he becomes cured. So then he asks his judges, his ulama, the people in his court, he said, okay, I said kathir, I said lots of dinar. Okay, so what number do I have to give to make it a lot? I said large, I gave some vague word, but what amount do I actually have to give so that this nadhr becomes fulfilled? Right? Because sometimes, we do the same thing too. We speak in very vague terms, but, Islam doesn't work like that. There's no, ambiguities there. Islam works off of these specificities. So, and Mutawakkil knew this as well too. So, all the same thing happened as before. All the different scholars in his court, they all gave different responses. They couldn't come to an agreement about what the actual amount would be. So, once again, they call our Imam al-Hadi alayhi salatu wassalam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala. And there he said, Mutawakkil, you have to give 83 dinar. And everybody's asking, like 83? He said, we said a lot, but where are you coming with this random, very specific number? How did you get 83? He said kathir dinar, right? Kathira. How in the world can you show that 83 is the number here? So, Imam once again replies from the Quran. He says, if you look at Surah Tawbah, right, Surah 9, Ayah 25, Allah says there, لَقَدْ نَصَّرَكُمُ اللَّهُ فِي مَوَاطِنٍ كَثِيرًا. That Allah has helped you, and He's speaking to Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala. And the Muslim Ummah in general. That we've given our nusrat, we've given you our help in mawatina kathira, in a large amount or a lot of different places. Or mawatin here is in the sense of battlefields. He said, because this ayah was about the help that Allah gave to the Muslims in these various expeditions and battles that took place during the time of the Prophet. And then you continue the ayah, I'm not going to read the rest, but it talks about Yawm Hunayn and all these other things, so I'll leave it there. So, when that happens, he says, look, that same word kathira is being used here. He said, during the Prophet's life, there was 83 total battles and expeditions that the Prophet himself was a part of. So that's why, since Allah is saying mawatina kathira over here, it was 83 total battles and expeditions, then the large amount, the kathir that you have to give is also going to be that exact same amount. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. What's interesting over here, and if you remember from when we were speaking on the wilada, right, on Sunday night, we talked about how the Ahlul Bayt would always try to encourage people to go back to the sources, right? When you're providing legal information, you have to source it back properly. They're not coming off the top of their head and saying, let me give you a rational answer. They're sourcing it back to the Quran first and foremost, right? In the previous case, you saw that, right? It was ayat of the Quran. And especially because they were dealing with, again, we're using the word Sunni very loosely then, right? Obviously Sunni judges then. So the Quran was pretty much the only source that was going to be there, that they could not dispute. In this example, what's interesting is that, yes, the Quran was obviously being used, but the word kathira was there, which is what they needed to hear. Right? Mutawakkil said, I want to give a large amount of dinar. So the Imam uses that same and sources that same exact word in the Quran, right? Kathira. But the way that this number was given its precision was because the Imam was able to transmit the seerah of the Prophet. He said, look, do you know how many battles and expeditions the Prophet took in or not? They were able to, the Imam was able to tell them that. So it wasn't just grabbing the Quran by itself. In this case, as we mentioned on Sunday, it was the Quran plus the application of the Sunnah on the Quran as well. Because the word kathira by itself wouldn't be helpful to anybody. You would have to know that the kathira here has to do with the battles that took place. It has to do with the battles where the Prophet himself was present. Then you would have to know the exact number of the battles that took place. And of course, because the people are not going to deny that the family of the Prophet knew the amount of battles that took place, they couldn't say anything. So in a sense, this makes us think. A lot of individuals now, some of these speakers, they have this methodology, they call it Quran-centric, back to the Quran. And we're not saying go back to the Quran. Of course, the Quran, is there. But remember, Rasulullah said, I'm leaving thaqalain. Not just one of these. I'm leaving two things that can never be separated from one another. So don't just give me an ayah of the Quran, especially out of context, with no explanation and clarification, and expect us to just go along with that. If you do not combine it with the seerah of the Prophet, with the explanation and clarification from the Ahlul Bayt, those little ayat that you're bringing out of context are not really going to be as helpful as you think. So when somebody, nowadays we have the same sort of arguments like, well, music or whatever is not mentioned directly in the Quran. Like, okay. The timings of salah are not mentioned in the Quran too. Hijab, people say, is not mentioned in the Quran. Okay, technically you're right. But Allah didn't say, take the Quran only and run away. He said, no, every single thing that the Prophet gives you, you take. Everything he forbids you, you keep away from. And the Prophet said, you have to, in order to understand the Quran, you have to stay with the Ahlul Bayt too. Otherwise, this Quran is not going to make any sense. Even if you look at some of these ayat, a person who says, no, the ayat are very, very clear. And I don't have time for tonight to go through this, but for your own, investigation. Somebody who even knows their Arabic perfectly, Fusha, classical Arabic. If you look at some of these ayat, like the ayat of wudu, right? This is where Sunnis and Shias obviously have a disagreement. There's many parts that are very clear about washing and wiping, but the one part that's a major difference is when we're talking about the washing of the hands, or the arms rather. Because we as followers of the Ahlul Bayt, we start from elbow, or technically above the elbow, and we go down. We say, you can't go the other way, right? If you literally look at the ayah, it says, ila al-marafiq. It says to go to your elbow. It says it the other way around if you're using it and reading it literally. So somebody could say, look, the literal reading says go to your elbow. You say, look, there's different ways. Again, I don't want to go into the Arabic of how prepositions and things like that are used. He said, look, if you want to take a literal interpretation of the Quran and wash it this way or this way, you can go ahead and do that. But when we see that the cousin, the son-in-law, the brother, the akhi, the daughter, the children, the grandchildren, the followers, the people who are within the household of the Ahlul Bayt, that they're washing it one way and they're telling everybody else to wash it one way. When the people who are in Medina, even of course you guys know that the Maliki school of thought, right, who many of them, they say Malik was somebody who was in Medina himself. So he was very close to the people who we would consider followers of the Ahlul Bayt, even if they weren't Shia. He allows, and a lot of his rulings are very, let's say, Shia friendly, or very related to us too. Whether it's praying, he allows for praying with hands down and things like that. And they say that it's because he was around people who followed the Ahlul Bayt. So because he saw that seerah, he applied it too. So without these sort of explanations in the hadith, how would you know all of these things? So it's this Quran only and Quran centric approach. In theory, it sounds nice, but in application, this will actually take somebody astray. And then at the end of the day, you'll say, well, there's no timing to pray because the timings have not been explained clearly in the Quran. They come in the hadith. The rulings for hijab clearly don't come in the Quran. They come in the hadith, right? The relationships and, touching or non-touching non-mahram, they come in the hadith. Specific ways to do wudu in the hadith. Explanations for salah, for hajj, all these things come in the hadith. So this whole, movement that's been happening recently of, back to the Quran, say, look, if you go back to the Quran, no problem. Make sure you don't, discard and leave the Ahlul Bayt. Otherwise, that Quran now is now going to be a source of dalalat and misguidance for you. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So just to quickly summarize, we mentioned today that law, legal theory itself was a way for the khulafa and governments even to this day to exert their influence and power. But still, people like Mutawakkil had to rely when they were when their own people couldn't agree on a ruling, they had to go to the only true source of knowledge, which was the knowledge of the Imam of the time. And these two stories that we shared were how the Imam was able clearly, very quickly, concisely, and profoundly through his wisdom, divine given knowledge, was able to give clear answers to these fiqhi issues that took place. And in that way was also able to show the general public that if you want to go for true knowledge, to really understand the words of Allah and the seed of the Prophet, it can only be obtained from Muhammad and Ali Muhammad alayhi wassalatu wassalam. And of course, we remember that this influence that was exerted over and over and over again by the khulafa, like the Abbasids, these small moments where the Ahlul Bayt then responded and lowered the dignity and value of these khulafa by these sorts of issues, the khulafa couldn't take it because they saw how the people then started to orient themselves more towards the imams. And this is why we see time and time again that the khulafa say, we can't take this anymore. We have to eliminate them. We can't, house arrest is not working. Harassment is not working. Torturing them is not working. Seizing their money is not enough. We have no choice. And the khulafa then had to end the lives of the imams based on this. And of course, this was also the case, not Mutawakkil himself, but either Mu'tamid or Mu'taz, one of the followers, somebody who came after Mutawakkil, ordered for poison to be delivered to Imam al-Hadi. When the Imam was given this poison, they say that every Imam who was given poison had their own unique type of effect. You remember, for example, Imam al-Mujtaba. The poison that was given to him was unique in the fact that it was so strong in the way that it affected his internal organs that they say that he was spitting up pieces of his liver. And he had a special bowl that he kept on the side of his bed where he would spit up these pieces of his liver and hide it every time that Zainab would come in the room. We remember Imam al-Rida. The strength of the poison, it was an instant one. It didn't take a long time. The strength of the poison, it was so shadid and so intense that the hadith say that when the Imam took it, immediately he took his handkerchief and covered his mouth and began coughing up blood right away and then collapsed on the floor with nobody there to catch him. And he told Ma'mun at that time, he said, let me go now and rest at home because your job has been done. And we come to Imam al-Naqi, Imam al-Hadi. They say that this was so intense that they say he was lying in bed. And the effect on his body was that he could barely move. There was no movement allowed from his bed. He would need to be taken care of in every single moment then. And this one, they say that it lasted longer than some of the other poisons. Imagine how his followers, how his children, imagine Imam al-Askari seeing his father in a position like this. After the Imam passes, Imam al-Askari and some of the Shia are gathered. The ghusl is performed. The kafan is put on. They're performing the Salatul Janaza, and then they are getting ready to bury their Imam. That time, the Imam, we know, tried their best to give people the memory of Imam Hussein, because we know during Mutawakkil's time, he had destroyed and tried to stop people and forbade people visiting Karbala. He tried to make it haram and forbidden and illegal for people to go and do Ziyarat of Imam Hussein. So we can only imagine what was going through the minds of the people when they were attending the Janazah of Imam al-Hadi. We can only imagine what was going through the mind of Imam al-Askari as he was there performing the ghusl, as he was there with all the women sending their final salams to their Imam. And they could perhaps imagine that we are here in peace right now, able to perform the ghusl for our Imam, but our grandfather Hussein, when he was on the battlefield, not a drop of water was given to him. There was no ghusl for him on the battlefield. Instead, he was met with a dagger of shimmer on his throat. We remember how now Imam al-Naqi is surrounded by his family and friends, whereas the final moments of Imam Hussein is not surrounded by his family. He has to leave Zainab, Aunt al-Zainabiyya. He has to leave Sakina after after putting her to sleep on his chest back on the tents, he has to leave Imam Sajjad back in his tent as well. And the next time he gets to see them is when they pass by Imam Hussein's battle on the battlefield, and Zainab collapses on top of the body of Imam Hussein. Ala la'natullah ala qawmi adh-dhalimin wa saya'lamu alladhina zalamu ayya munqalibin yanqalibun. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un ridan biqada'ihi wa tasliman li amri. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
मैं खाक के पास सो जाऊंगी, मैं खाक के पास सो जाऊंगी, हाँ कहती हूँ बाबा सीने पे सुलाने को, कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा सीने पे सुलाने को, कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा सीने पे सुलाने को, कहाँ कहती बाबा। कहती हूँ कि चेहरा ही दिखा जाइए बाबा, मरने से मेरे पहले ही आ जाइए बाबा, पहलू में छुपाने को, कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा, मैं खाक के पास सो जाऊंगी, हाँ कहती हूँ बाबा सीने पे सुलाने को, कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा सीने पे सुलाने को, कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा। बच्चे तो बहुत छोटे हुआ करते हैं बाबा, हर एक मुसीबत पे गिला करते हैं बाबा, मैं नाज उठाने को, कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा, मैं खाक के पास सो जाऊंगी, हाँ कहती हूँ बाबा सीने पे सुलाने को, कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा सीने पे सुलाने को, कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा। सह लूंगी जो हाथों की लकीरों में लिखा है, जिंदा की अंधेरों का गिला किसने किया है, मैं शम में जलाने को, कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा, मैं खाक पास सो जाऊंगी, हाँ कहती हूँ बाबा सीने पे सुलाने को, कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा सीने पे सुलाने को, कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा। बाबा मेरे बचपन का तकाजा तो नहीं था, ख्वाबों में खिलौने थे, जनाजा तो नहीं था, गोदी में खिलाने को, कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा, मैं खाक पास सो जाऊंगी, हाँ कहती हूँ बाबा सीने पे सुलाने को, कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा सीने पे सुलाने को, कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा। बाबा मेरे जख्मों की दवा कौन करेगा, अब जान सकीना को भला कौन कहेगा, पहलू में छुपाने को कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा, मैं खाक पास हो जाऊंगी, हाँ कहती हूँ बाबा, सीने पे सुलाने को कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा, सीने पे सुलाने को कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा, कोई भी नहीं आंसू मेरे पहुँचने वाला, सर पे नहीं हाथों को कोई फेरने वाला, बाहों में छुपाने को कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा, मैं खाक पास हो जाऊंगी, हाँ कहती हूँ बाबा, सीने पे सुलाने को कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा, सीने पे सुलाने को कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा, मर जाऊं अगर बाबा तेरा शाम हो आना, बीमार अकेला है जनाजे को उठाना, गोदी में उठाने को कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा, मैं खाक पास हो जाऊंगी, हाँ कहती हूँ बाबा, सीने पे सुलाने को कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा, सीने पे सुलाने को कहाँ कहती हूँ बाबा। अल-फातिहा।
अस्सलामु अलैका या रसूल अल्लाह, अस्सलामु अलैका या अमीरुल मोमिनीन, अस्सलामु अलैकी या फातिमतुज़ ज़हरा सय्यदती निसाइल आलमीन, अस्सलामु अलैका या हसनुल मुज्तबा, अस्सलामु अलैकी या उख्तिक ज़ैनब, अस्सलामु अलल हुसैन वला अली इब्नुल हुसैन वला औलादिल हुसैन वला असहाबिल हुसैन जमीअन शुहदाए करबला व रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू। अस्सलामु अलैकुम अइम्मतुल मुस्लिमीन अली इब्नुल हुसैन व मुहम्मद इब्न अली व जाफ़र इब्न मुहम्मद व मूसा इब्न जाफ़र व अली इब्न मूसा व मुहम्मद इब्न अली व अली इब्न मुहम्मद वल हसन इब्न अली। अस्सलामु अलैका या इमाम साहिबुल अस्री वज़्ज़मान, अल अमान अल अमान अल अमान। अस्सलामु अलैका या खलीफतुर रहमान, अस्सलामु अलैका या शरीकल कुरआन, अस्सलामु अलैका या काबतल ईमान, अस्सलामु अलैका या इमामुल इंसी वल जान। अजअल्लाहु तआला फरजक व सहरल्लाहु तआला मखरजक व ज़ुहूरक व जअलना मिन अंसारिक व रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू। अल्लाहुम्मा सल्लि अला मुहम्मदिन व आलि मुहम्मद। अल्लाहुम्मा कुल्लि वलियकल हुज्जत इब्न अल हसन सलवातुका अलैहि व अला आबाइहि फ़ी हादिस साअति व फ़ी कुल्लि साअ वलिया व हाफ़िज़ा व क़ाइदन व नासिरा दलीलन व ऐना हत्ता तुस्किनहु अर्दका तौआ व तुमत्तिअहु फ़ीहा तवीला बिरहमतिका या अरहमर राहिमीन। अल्लाहुम्मा सल्लि